Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf kaf in Bava Kama, and we are at the very top of the page, and we're having a conversation about various different stories that relate to and cases that involve shame, the concept of eating. As a reminder, we've seen that if your animal eats in the property of the damaged party, well, given the fact that you're in somebody else's property, you need to be very careful and watch your animal more closely, and you cannot allow it to eat. If you do, then you will. If you do, then you will be fully liable. On the other hand, if in fact the animal is in the public thoroughfare in Rishus Harabim, well then it's expected that it will eat things that it has access to, and so as a result, if in fact it were to do so, it would not actually be it would not actually be a problem. Because it's on some level on the owner of the fruit and vegetable that the animal eats to be more careful. So as we pick up now at the very top, first word on Kaf Amid Aleph, we get a new story. So Hahu Barcha, and Rashi explains Barcha is an aze, a goat. Dechaza lifta apuma dedana. That it happened to see a turnip on top of a barrel. So sarach sleek. It paws and climbs. So achla lilifta v'tavre ludana, and now it actually ate the turnip and it broke the barrel. So chayve Rava alifta v'adana nezek shalim. That Rava said that both the turnip and that the person who owns the goat is liable both for the turnip and the barrel. So my timer, what's the basis for being obligated for the barrel? Kevin de orche lemecha lifta. The point is that if it's normal for the goat to climb a little bit to eat the turnip, it's normal for it if it's normal for the goat to eat the turnip, it's normal for it to climb up a little bit in order to get itself to the barrel in order to enable itself to be able to eat the turnip. And if that all is normal behavior, well, then the breaking of the barrel is normal behavior as part of the eating of the turnip, and it would be fully liable as part of shame. Okay, so that is the first ruling of the day. Next ruling: Armor ilfa behema birshus harabim ufashta tzavara va'achla me'alga bechaverta. So now Ilfa says that if you have an animal that reaches out its neck and eats from on top of another animal. So again, my animal, although my animal itself is in Rishus Harabim, one can argue that the space on top of my animal is Rishus Hayachid, is my own private domain. And so as a result, because your animal went and reached out and ate from on top of my animal, it's as if you went into my rishus and chayeve, so you're liable. My taima, what's the reason? Because gabi chaverta kachatzer hanisik dami. That in this situation, the back of the animal is like the yard of the damaged property of the damaged party, and so as a result, it's as if you went into my yard and you did damage and you did shame, and so as a result, the result is full liability. So let's say that the following brisa is going to be a proof that Ilfa's got the right idea. Because haisa kupa so mufsheles la'achorav, if a person's got a backpack that's open behind him, it's like a basket on his back, ufashta tzavara v'achla mimenu chayeves, and another animal reaches out and its neck and eats from that basket, so then the owner of the animal is liable. So the animal itself effectively is liable, but the idea is that the owner is liable. The language here notes that effectively, again, chayeves is sort of a female language. It's referring to the animal itself. Obviously, it doesn't mean that the animal is supposed to take out of its own pocket. Animals don't have pockets, and so as a result, it would, we're talking about the owner being liable. Well, that doesn't have to be a proof, because maybe we're saying that this is actually just like Rava said in a different case, that we're talking about where the animal jumped. So hachinami b'kovetzes, that in the other case it's where the animal jumped. Here too, we're talking about where the animal jumped. And let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi
Well,
helps us
before
understand.
you mentioned animals don't have pockets. Chazal did not know about marsupials.
That's a fair point. I guess kangaroos do have pockets, but okay. But fair point. With that exception, they certainly don't have wallets in those pockets. At least somebody else put them. All right. So this is the top line of Rashi. Bikofetzes shekavtza v'achla al tzavara. The point is that it jumped up and it ate on on its neck. So she'ain darka bakach. That is not a normal thing for the animal to do. The tolda de Karen and Sahu. And as a result, this is not, in fact, an aspect of Shane, but now it is an unlikely method of doing damage. So as a result, it's a subset of Karen. Karen, of course, is again goring, is the one that covers goring. And when we say that it's chayeves, when we say that the animal is obligated and that therefore the owner has to pay, we're talking about half damages, because that is the form of damages that relates to Karen. Okay. So therefore, we tried to bring a proof to Ilfa, and we were unsuccessful. Now, when we contradicted the proof to Ilfa, we cited Rava, and we noted that he made this statement about that animal jumping in another case, and we could apply that same logic to this case. So where was it that Rava made that statement? So, the Amar Rabbi Oshia, he said it in connection with the statement of Rabbi Oshia. Behema birshos harabim halacha of achla patura. If an animal is walking in rishos harabim, well then it eats, it is not liable. Amda va'achla, but if it's standing and eating, chayebes, then it is liable. Well, that leads to a very almost obvious question, because Maishna halcha de orchehu, amdanami orchehu. You're differentiating between when an animal is walking in public and when it's standing in public. But both of those actions are normal for an animal to do in public. So why should there be a difference in the liability? Why, when the animal walks, is it liable, the owner liable, and why is when it stands is the owner? I'm sorry, why when it walks, the owner's not liable, and why when it stands, the owner is liable. So, Gemara, so that is where Rava made his initial statement, Rava b'kofetzes, that when we say umda, that it's not moving around, that it's not traveling, we're talking about where it is jumping, where it jumps up to get the food. And that, again, is not normal behavior for the domesticated large animals that we're talking about, that would be in somebody's possession. So that is the answer to the question as to where Rava made his original statement. So again, we have Ilfa's statement. It does not seem like we paskin like that statement. And so now we go to the next question. So but it does seem like we do paskin like this concept of kofetzes, that if in fact an animal jumps up and does an unusual act in order to, even though that act is in order to eat, we will put that act under Karen rather than under Shane. So a key aspect of Shane is a normality associated with it. Okay. So boy Rabbi Zera Miskal Gelma.
So if I have an elephant or a giraffe,
mm-hmm.
It's going to be different from if I have a smaller animal that needs to jump.
That is absolutely correct. It depends on what they have access to. 100%. If a giraffe, in somebody else's field, accesses an apple at the top of the tree, and eats that apple, then you, as the giraffe owner, would be liable.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, if you instead bring your pet, I guess cat, we can start with that, and
Mhm.
it somehow jumps up to the, as cats are wont to do,
They
but
do.
maybe.
They jump high, very high. It could easily jump on top of a horse or a camel.
Really? Wow. Okay. Well, in any event, the point is that they jump in a manner that we're going to assume at the moment is unusual for it to jump in order to eat. So maybe a cat's not the best answer,
Yeah,
or a
that's
dog
true.
either.
It is usual for cats to jump high distances.
Yeah. So in any event, let's stick with maybe a goat or a cow. So you bring your goat in to that same field, and now it does not have the ability to reach that apple on its own, but it jumps up and grabs the apple. That would not You would not be liable under Shane. You would be liable under Karen, and it would be only Chatzi Nezek. So that would be the example. So that, yes, putting it absolutely, there would be a difference between the nature of the animal. The nature of the animal is clearly relevant to the inquiry. Okay, so by Rabbi Zera Misgalgel Mahu, new case. We're going to first, we'll define it without saying what it means, and then we'll give both Rashi and Tosos's explanation as we go through. So, sorry for not scrolling. So we have something's rolling. So what's the law? So Hechidami, what do you mean that something's rolling? Kagon dekaima amir b'shus hayachid. We're talking about a situation where you have some kind of amir is understood as straw, some kind of straw that's in a private domain. Misgalgel v'asi mirishus hayachid l'rishus harab, and now it's rolling. Maybe it's a bushel of straw, and it's rolling from the private domain to the public domain. Now, Rashi and Tosfos here disagree. Rashi says that we're talking about where the animal is causing it to roll. The animal is causing it to move. And Tosfos says, no, 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 it's rolling on its own. So, and now what happens? Now, again, the Gemara itself just tells us that it's rolling from private to public. It doesn't say exactly where it is being eaten. And again, Rashi and Tosfos disagree. Rashi says that it's rolling to the public domain. I mean, that the animal is dragging it to the public domain, and it then eats it there in the public domain. So for Rashi, we're going to say, now what's the law in this case? Meaning, what do we say that we focus on where the animal started with the object, or do we focus on where the animal ate the object? And for Tosfos disagrees and says, no, it's talking about where the item was rolling on its own, and it would have rolled into the public domain, but the animal ate it before it got to the public domain. So do we focus on where it was going to go and therefore say that it should be as if it was in public domain, or do we say, no, you focus on where the eating happened? So those are the questions according to Rashi and Tosfos. So now, what's the answer? So we see that the answer is we're going to try to bring a proof from a brisa. So Tashma, Ditani Rabbi Chia Masoi Mikzaso bifnim umikzaso bachutz. You have a burden, a load that is partially in and partially out. We're going to understand that it means partially in the public domain and out of the public domain, or in the private domain and out of the private domain. So achlam b'mifnim chayeves. If you ate it on the inside, meaning in the private domain, well, then you're going to be fully chayev. Achla b'chutz petura. If you ate it on the outside, well, then you're not going to be liable. Now, what exactly do we mean here? Our first understanding is that you ate the entire thing. And as a result, the point is that what was inside from the burden got pulled outside, or what was outside got pulled inside, depending on where the animal was. And again, the location of the animal's eating seems to be the key. The key is that whether or not the animal ate inside or outside. So my lab misgalgal v'asi, right? Isn't this a case of rolling and coming, meaning that the animal was able to bring all of the food, the burden into the inside, and therefore that's why it would be liable if it was inside, and because it was inside the Rishus Hayachid. And on the other hand, if it's outside, if it's in the Rishus Harabim and it brings it all outside, it's not liable because it's always in the Rishus, because you focus on where it's eating. Low. No, that does not necessarily have to be a good proof for the fact that we focus on eating and not on where it started, because ema achla al masha b'fnim mechayebes. Maybe when we say that it's the eating of the stuff that is already inside, and al masha b'chutz patura, or on what's already outside. Meaning, maybe the answer is that it doesn't make a difference where the eating happens. What matters is where it started. Meaning, you can interpret this brisa in two different ways. And so as a result, it's not going to bring a good proof. Moreover, or maybe you can actually say that we're talking about a situation of aspasta. Aspasta is considered, Rashi says, that it is, Rashi gives an idea about what that aspasta is sort of a single load that is one long thing, and it's got one end of it on the inside and one end of it on the outside. And so as a result, even though you end up eating the stuff that was outside when the animal was inside, because it's all one load, since the animal was bringing it all in together, it's one object, we're going to follow the location of the animal. However, in an ordinary case where the animal took something from Rishus Harabim and that was all in Rishus Harabim, and then brought that item into Rishus Hayachid, or vice versa, according to Rashi, took the object that was fully in Rishus Hayachid and brought it out to Rishus Harabim, we would maybe focus on where the object began and not where it did the eating. So maybe a long object would be treated differently than an object that was fully inside or fully outside and is brought to the other location. And according to Tosos, who focuses on where it was going, again, the point is that when you have something that is already partially inside and partially outside, maybe that's where you'll focus on where the eating happened. But if the whole thing was going to leave, well, then it wouldn't. Then you would focus on where it was going to go. So the bottom line is that we have been unable to answer the question as to whether we focus on the eating or the original location of the object. Okay, so next question, achla kusus. So now we quote our Gemara. Gemara quotes our Mishnah, where we talked about an animal eating a garment, something that is unlikely, not normal. And in our Mishnah, we had three separate statements as reflected on the screen. We had statement number one, eating something normal results in full liability. Then we said eating something unusual results in 50% payment because, again, it's unusual, and therefore it's not under Shane, but under Karen. Then we said that this applies in the domain of the damaged, but in the public domain, one is exempt. So the question is, it is clear, everybody agrees that line, the modification of this applies in the domain of the damage, but in the public domain, one's exempt. Everybody agrees that it refers also back to statement number one, that when you have full liability, it's talking about Shane in the Rishus of the Nizak. But what about case number two? Do we say that if an animal eats something unusual in the public domain, right? When an animal eats something unusual in the public domain, is there 50% liability? Do we say that it's part of Keren, and Keren does apply in Rishus Harabim? Or do we say no? It is true that we're treating it like Keren, but it also has an aspect of Shane. And as a result, because when we said that it applies in the domain of the damage, it would also be true with respect to eating something unusual. So that's we're going to have a debate. So Ahai, which line does the last qualification refer? So Amar Rav says Akulhu. It applies to all of them. So my timer, what's the reason? Kolhan mashana uva achar v'shinabo pater. Well, the point is that anybody who does something strange and now somebody else does something strange and causes damage to the initial strange action, well, that second party is not going to be liable. Let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi helps us out here. 3, 6, 9. We're counting from the bottom. It's about 20 lines up. Kol hamishana kagon zeh shehinia kisuso v'kela b'rishus harabim. The point is that the person who left their clothing or other vessels in Rishus Harabim, that's not a normal thing to do. You know that there's risk. Now, we're not saying that the person intended it to become Hefker, but there was a lack of concern and irregularity to the behavior. And therefore, when that object that was put down in Rishus Harabim now is damaged, well, you did the initial mistake of putting it down. So when somebody else's animal comes and eats it, they're not going to be liable for something irregular happening. Ushmuel Amar lo shanu ela peros v'yirakos. No, it's only referring back to the fruit and the vegetables, meaning it's only in the case where the animal eats something normal. But if in fact an animal were to eat something like a garment or utensils in Rishus Harabim, well, then you would be liable to 50% because you are still liable. So what is this dispute about? So v'chein amar Reish Lakish akulu, and so we similarly have a debate between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan along the same ways. That Reish Lakish says that it refers to both of the categories. V'az the Reish Lakish l'tamei, and Reish Lakish follows his reasoning. Damar Reish Lakish shtei farot b'rishus harabim. Achas revutza, achas malechas. You got two animals that are two cows that are in the public domain. You have one that's sort of sitting and one that's walking. Well, you know what? Sitting is not somebody might say to you, if you were to sit down on the sidewalk in New York City, this is a place for walking. This is not a place for sitting. So, ba'ata mahalechas b'revutza patura. If the walking animal now goes and kicks the sitting animal, well, then that animal's not liable according to Reish Lakish, because the first animal did something unusual. It sat down in the middle of Rishus Harabim. So, but revutza mahalechas chayeves. But if the sitting one kicks the walking animal, well, then there is going to be a liability, because that is a kicking again. Excuse me, is a tolda of Keren, and so as a result, it would be subject to 50% liability, assuming that the animal is a tam. And so as a result, because the walking is a normal behavior, it's the fact that the sitting animal is sitting, or it doesn't really matter what the sitting animal is doing, whether it's sitting or walking. The point is that the other animal didn't do anything unusual. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Lo shano ela b'peiros v'yirakos, that just like Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, the Mishnah applies only to the case of fruits and vegetables. Aval ksus v'kelim chayeves, but when it comes to garments and utensils, so then the owner of the animal would be liable even if it were eaten in the public thoroughfare. Because so now the question is, and again, the reason is because it's let's hold off for a moment, because the Gemara is going to actually help us with the reason. But the Gemara is first going to ask, does Rabbi Yochanan agree with the example given by Reish Lakish? So Lema Rabbi Yochanan Leislei Deresh Lakish Afilu B'Shtei Paros. Do we need to say, given that Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Reish Lakish and with Rav in connection with the understanding of our Mishnah, does that also mean that he would disagree with the case of two cows, one squatting and one walking? No, it does not mean that he has to also disagree with Reish Lakish on that. He could say that the squatting cow would be liable, or the owner of the squatting cow would be liable if it kicked, but the owner of the walking cow would not be liable. Because La'olam Islay, he could really hold that. And why is there a difference between squatting cows and garments and vessels? So kasus adi inchi b'manche gulime umitafche. So because when it comes to a garment, people put it down and put down their coat in order to leave it there for a minute. People don't necessarily always have it on them and protected. And therefore, it's not actually that unusual for somebody to put it down. It may not be the best idea, but it's not so outside the norm as to remove the liability for a second actor. Aval behema lav orcha. But when it comes to animals squatting in the middle of the public domain, that is not what they usually do. Usually they continue to move so that they can get home and complete their errands. So as a result, what we end up having here is two sets of disagreements. We have a set of disagreements about whether or not how to understand our Mishnah, and we have a set of disagreements about what is considered normal or abnormal. And so as a result, it is that aspect that is highlighted by the situation of the squatting and walking animals, and the case of the putting your vessels and garments down in Rishos Harabim. Again, best idea: don't put your stuff down in a public thoroughfare. Make sure to go to a corner in order to stay safe and avoid people bumping into you from behind. Okay.
If you leave it in Rishon Harabim in Israel, the bomb squad may come and blow it up.
That is definitely true. An extra reason to be specifically careful.
I personally saw that happen once.
Oh boy, that's kind of scary. All right. Next item is our Mishnah noted that although one does not pay full damages for shane in the public domain, the owner of the animal must still pay for the amount of the benefit. So now the Gemara is going to discuss how one calculates this amount. So the imnenes mishalemes, right? So our Mishnah said that if it benefits, then you need to pay. But kama, how much do you have to pay? So we're going to have two methods of calculation. And indeed, I got to send a note to somebody that this is obviously something that we actually, a concept that we have in secular law as well, with this concept of quantum meruit, that sometimes you may not be liable based on sort of the contract value, but you may be liable based on the value that was provided to you. And so how much do you need to pay? Rabba Amar Demei Amir, that you pay the value of straw. The reason is that straw, you didn't need to pay them. If the animal ate apples, you weren't going to feed, expensive apples to your animal. You were going to feed, straw, the cheapest stuff. Rava Amar Demei Seorim Bizol. Rava says, no, you got the benefit of a nicer food. So you need to pay the nice food price that people would do for their animals. Meaning you don't have to pay apple value, but you still have to pay a value associated with something that sometimes owners would give to their animals. And that would be barley. But we're going to qualify that because people don't give barley to their animals at full price. They would likely only do it when barley was really cheap. So at the cheap price for barley, that would be the value that you would need to use. Okay, so Tanya Kavasi Durabba, Tanya Kavase de Rava. So we have actually barisas that support each of Rabba and Rava. Because Tanya Kavase de Rabba, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Amar Ein Mishalemes Eladumei Amir Bilvad. Very explicit, very clear. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says exactly like Rabba says, that you pay only the value of straw. And Tanya Kavase de Rava, but we also have a brisa that supports Rava because im nenes mishalemes masha nenes ketzad. So we say that if it benefits, you have to pay for the benefit. So what does that mean? So achla kav o kabayim, if an animal eats a kav or two kavs, and here we're talking about something more expensive. Ein omrim tishalim demehem. We don't say that they have to pay their value. Ela omdim kama adam rotzel lahachil levehemto. How much would a person be willing to feed his animal? Davar haroilo, something that is fit for animals, even though it's not something that is often fed. Meaning, what would you give to your animal as a treat? So the way I view this is sort of like, there's dog food and there's dog treats. If in fact your dog comes into somebody else's yard and eats the food on their picnic table. So, well, actually, I'm sorry, because that's in private domain. So that would be fully liable. What I mean is, if somebody now goes into the park and on the park bench, you've put your lunch out, and the animal comes and grabs it, and so as a result, the owner is only liable for the value of the benefit given to the dog. So then, assuming that the food is actually good for the dog, so then it would have to pay dog treat value. So if it ate 3 ounces of your, delicious peanut butter, I don't know, something that dogs can eat that isn't bad for them. I don't know, a salad. I have no idea if that's something. No, let's make a chicken sandwich. So you got some chicken sandwich, and the dog eats the chicken sandwich, and it's the chicken sandwich is 5 ounces. So then you need to the owner of the dog would need to pay sort of like the 5 ounces of the really nice dog biscuit price. But if in fact the animal ends up eating something that isn't helpful to it, it's actually bad for it. So the dog, God forbid, eats chocolate. So then the owner of the dog is not going to be liable because they in the public domain, because the thing that was eaten was not in any way a benefit for the owner, and so as a result, there's no benefit. And we're going to talk, and indeed, this now leads us, is going to lead us into into the situation of what happens when one person benefits and another person does not lose. This is one of the core sugyot in Shas. And it's a very interesting question of what happens when, again, I go into your field and gain some benefit. Maybe I sleep there overnight, but you don't have any losses associated with it. You weren't going to rent out that piece of the field, and so you didn't lose anything. And so I've benefited. You haven't lost. Is there any liability? So Amrle Rav Chisda Rami Bar Chama. Listen, it's a shame you weren't here with us yesterday when we were within the Tchum. So people understand that this is likely means that it was Shabbos and therefore he wasn't able to be there. But because the Ibailan Mili Malyasa, because we came up with some, we had some great questions. So Amar Mai Mili Ma'alia. So what was the great question? So Amar Lei Hadar B'Chatzer Chaveru Shalom Midaito. Listen, if a person lives in the yard of another person without his permission, Saruk Lahalos Lo Skar O Ein Sar. Do you need to pay the rent or do you not need to pay the rent? Well, hey Hidami, what's the story? If you're talking about somebody who isn't going to pay the rent, who isn't renting the yard, and the person who's there doesn't actually isn't somebody who would rent the yard, meaning, as Rashi explains it, we're talking about somebody who's wealthy and has plenty of places, but just happens to, fall asleep in your yard. Well, then zelo nene below zelo chaser. Well, then the person really didn't benefit, and the other person didn't lose. So of course you won't have to pay. But if you'd say that we're talking about a situation where the yard is set up for rental, you have tent spaces, and you rent those tent spaces out, and now this person took his tent and put it in the other place, and he needed a place to set up his tent. Well, then we have a situation where this one benefits and that one lost. So of course you're going to have to pay. So we've set aside those two sides. So lo tzrichi b'chatzer de lo kaima la'agra the gavra de avid l'meger. So where is the difficulty? That's the situation. We have to be talking about a situation where the person is not, the yard is not for rent, but a person who would rent it is the one who stays there. So do we say matzi amrle my chasartich? Do we say that, listen, the person who's staying there can say, listen, you haven't lost anything. You weren't planning to rent this out. I didn't cause you any loss. Tough luck. Oh, Dilma, Matzi Amar, or otherwise, maybe the other person could say, Ha is you benefited from me. And so as a result, you need to pay for that amount of benefit. So we're going to start now by citing our Mishnah. But before we get to that, we've only dealt with 3 of the 4 possible cases, right? We dealt with a case where the yard is not for rent and the occupant doesn't rent, so therefore there's no liability. We have the case where the occupant yard is for rent and the occupant usually rents, and therefore there is liability. And we have one of the 2 other corners, which is the yard is not for rent and the occupant rents. But what about if the yard is for rent and the occupant doesn't rent? So what about that situation? So that Tosfos answers his opinion, although his opinion is not the uniform opinion of the Rishonim. And so, but let's take a look and see what he says, giving Tosfos the advantage of being on the daf. So second to last Tosfos on the page, Ze ein nene v'ze ein chaser. So afilu b'chatzer de kaimel agra. Now, when it comes to even a field that is set up for renting, the gavra de lo avid l'miger, and the person is not one who rents, meaning it's somebody who doesn't need the field. So having matzi l'meimar de putter. That essentially Tosfos is saying, I think that case would also be exempt because kaven shalom nana, because the person who was there did not benefit, even though he caused a loss to his friend. And what's the proof? The proof is the following. If I throw you out of your house, and I lock the door in front of you, the damage that I've caused you is only indirect. I'm not going to be fully liable for the damage that I caused you. And so as a result, applying that same principle, Tosfos says that in the case where the person doesn't benefit, even if it was set up for rental, it was not, there would be no liability. So we're going to do now 5 quick efforts at trying to prove whether or not there's going to be liability. So Amrle Masnisan Rami Bar Chama said back, it's a Mishnah. So Hai Masnisan. Well, what Mishnah? Amrle Lechit Shamishli. Listen, do a little work for me. Some people understand that this is basically saying that you need to indicate that you are my Talmud, and so as a result, that way you'll be worthy of getting the details. So Shakel stood karachle. So he took his coat and folded it for him. So Amrle imnenes mishalemes manenes mashanenes. That if in fact it benefited, then you have to pay what the benefit was. That's our Mishnah. So that shows that the idea is that you do that even if the person doesn't lose, the person has benefited and therefore they have to pay. Well, Amarava Kamalo Chali below Margish Gavra de Mare Siaye. Once again, it must have been that the person was, sick and worried, and that's why he didn't, Hashem didn't help him, because the aval gav de lo dami lemasnisin kablamine, Rav Chisda accepted this argument, even though the case of our Mishnah isn't really comparable, because because in the case of our Mishnah, it was a case of one benefiting and one losing, meaning it wasn't a case of one benefiting and the other not losing. The person who owned the fruit and vegetables that were eaten did lose. Who? And you're going to tell me that this is a case of a one that one benefited and didn't lose? It's not true. So Rami Bar Chama, well, 1 second. How could Rami Bar Chama say that the cases are analogous? So Stam Peros Birshus Harabim Afkuri Mafkir Lahu. Well, the point is that if somebody is going to put their fruit down in a public domain, it's effectively abandoning them. This sort of highlights the debate that we had a few moments ago, that we had a debate as to whether or not putting the fruit down in a public domain is a normal action or an abnormal action, or putting a load down is a normal action or an abnormal action. And so here, this would suggest that it's not a normal action, and therefore, on some level, it would be as if you abandon them, and therefore, there would be arguably no loss to you, but you didn't actually abandon them, and therefore there would be liability for eating fruit, because there would not be liability for eating fruit because it's in the public domain, but at the same time the person benefited. So as a result, that's how Rami Bar Chama wanted to try and make the proof. But the bottom line is it doesn't seem like it's a great proof. So we try effort number two at trying to bring a proof. So Tnan Hamakiv Chaveru Mishalosh Ruchasav. We take a look in Rashi. Rashi's diagram is helpful here. That we have somebody who surrounds another person's field. So Reuben has a field around Shimon on 3 different sides. The Gadar as a Rishonav as a Shniyam as a Shlishis, and he fences in all 3 sides. Ein Mechayevin Oto. We do not obligate Shimon, the middle field, to pay for the fence. Haravias Mechayevin Oto. But the implication is, because that was the end of the Mishnah, that was the end of the quote from the Mishnah. The implication by saying that if you fence in only 3 sides, he's not obligated. The implication is that if you fence in the 4th side, he would be obligated. So Shmami na zenenev zelo chaser chayiv. So doesn't this show that when a person fenced in, when Reuven fences in all 4 sides of Shimon, that where Reuven has created a benefit for Shimon, but has not experienced any loss because he was fencing in his own yard? Well, then that's a situation where we say that Shimon is obligated to pay. Doesn't that prove our case? No. Shiny Hasam de Amr Le at Garamta Li Hakefa Yasera. No, because Reuven can tell Shimon that you are causing me to fence in extra. Because the bottom line is, without your field in the middle of mine, I wouldn't have needed all of this additional fencing. And so as a result, if I actually give you a benefit by fencing in your entire field, well, then you need to pay your fair share. Tashma. So no proof again. So Tashma, next part. And this is the end of that same Mishnah. That Mishnah, I believe, was in Bava Basra, Daf Dalet Amud Bet. So Amar Rabbi Yossi Im Amad Nikaf V'Gadar Es HaRavias. If the inner guy, if Shimon comes and fences the 4th side, Megalgalin Alav as a kol. Well, that shows that he liked the whole thing. So why do we? And therefore he has to pay his share of everything. Well, time of the Gadar Nikaf. What's the reason that he has to get up and pay? Is because he got up and fenced in the last side. Hamakif Pater. That implies that if Reuven would have done it instead of Shimon, then he wouldn't have been liable. So Shmamina zen and evizelo chaser Pater. Shouldn't we learn from this that one who benefits and the other one doesn't lose, he's exempt? No, shiny hasam de amrle ledidi sagili bintira barzuza. I didn't need, so maybe he would have to give some kind of payment, but he certainly doesn't have to pay half of the price of the actual fence, because maybe the inner person could say, listen, I didn't need a fancy schmancy fence. I would have been sufficient with some inexpensive bushes. So therefore, I don't need to pay you, or certainly don't need to pay you the full amount. So Tashma. So again, haven't proven anything. So we now go to the next one. Habayis b'haliyah shel hashnayim shenaflu. You have a two-level apartment building, and a person lives upstairs and owns the upstairs apartment, and a person owns the downstairs apartment. And unfortunately, it collapsed. Thankfully, no, neither of them were there. So Amr Bal Ha'aliyah lebal Habayis livnos who livnos v'hu eno rotzem. So the top guy says, listen, I need you to build the house again. I need you to contribute to build the ground story so that I can build my second story. And the person on the bottom says he doesn't want to. So hare bal haliyah bonabais. So then if the upper person builds a house, he can build just his lower level. The yoshiba ad sheyitin lo yitziosa. And he can live there in the lower level, even though that officially is space owned by the owner of the lower level, until the owner of the lower level gives him the expenses that are his share of the expenses. Yitziu sub who demechayev le baal habayis. So what do we see? The lower guy only has to give his expenses. Hascharo low, but we don't. But there is no obligation of the person who's living in the lower level now, who owns the upper level but is living in the lower level. He doesn't have to pay rent to the person who owns the lower level. So shmamina zen nana bezelo chaser patur. So we see that the person who benefits and the other one doesn't lose. The person is exempt, and here the lower level guy doesn't lose because he wasn't willing to build his house. So shiny hasam de vesela aliyah mishtabed. No, that case could be different because the ground story has some duty to provide to provide the space essentially to the upper floor. So Tashma. So again, case number 5, effort number 5. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Av Zeh. Now this is again same Mishnah. This Mishnah is from Bava Metzia Daf Kuf Yud Zion, and now the later part of that Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says that even the one who lives in the lower level, who lives in the upper level, he's going to, without permission of the person who lives in the lower level, he does have to pay rent. So so doesn't this show that the person who benefits and the other one doesn't lose, you have an obligation? No, shiny hasam mishum shachrurisa da ashyasa. That what's different in that situation is that there's a blackening of the walls. Here, the person has just rebuilt the lower level. Well, if the obligation is to pay the full cost associated with the expenses of building it, well, then if you in fact live in my apartment that I'm going to end up paying for, when I pay you for it, you need to pay me rent because I am paying for a brand new apartment, but you are actually giving me back a used apartment, and so as a result, I deserve rent associated with that. And so therefore, we're not going to actually, so this in fact is a case of zenen v'zechaser. And so as a result, there is appropriate liability, and we've not brought any proof. So shlachua be Rabbi Ami, so Rabbi Ami's yeshiva sent and a question, and Amar v'chimeh asalo uma chisiro uma hizika. Well, 1 second. What the person who's living in the bottom apartment, what has he done to cause any damage to the other person in this situation, or in a broad situation of the field where there is no damage? So Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Nisyashiv Hadavar. The Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, listen, I got to think about it. So Hadar Shlachua Kamei to Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So they sent him another message. Amar Kuli Hai Shalchuli Vazli. Listen, why are you sending me so many questions? Ilu Ashkechi. I know the question. Ilu Ashkechiva. If I knew Uvataima, Lo Shalchana Lo. If I would have known the reason, do you think I wouldn't have sent you an answer? Of course, I'm going to send you an answer. All right. So, what is the answer? Well, for that, you're going to need to stay tuned, God willing, to tomorrow's daf. This is again one of the most interesting sugyot in Shas. I hope you're enjoying it and look forward to continuing the learning of it together. Again, tomorrow morning, 7:30 instead of 7:45. I probably will still come here, but definitely we'll have Zoom as well. Have a great day, everybody.
There's your card.